All right, good morning, everybody. It's Jaleesa from MEMA. Just wanted to say it's 9:58, so we'll get started in the next couple of minutes here, but also just wanted to do an audio check to make sure everybody could hear me.
I can hear you, Jaleesa.
Perfect, thank you. I have a new setup today and was a little nervous.
You are loud and clear on my end. You're loud and clear on Eastern Shore.
All right, good morning. It's Jaleesa from MEMA, State Hazard Mitigation Officer. So thank you once again. I think this is our fourth or maybe fifth and final technical assistance session for BRIC. So hopefully you all have found everything so far to be informative and to kind of like serve as a guide and maybe kind of steer you as you're developing or hopefully finalizing the development of your sub applications over the course of the next few weeks. So as a reminder, the sub applications are due to MEMA November 20th. So we greatly appreciate you all working hard to meet those deadlines to make sure we have sufficient time on our end to complete the remaining steps. And also it gives us an opportunity to review your application in full. And should we find anything where we feel like additional information or clarity might be needed to build a stronger application, like that's the time between November and January when we submit that we'll do those things. So with that, we'll kind of go ahead and jump into things for today. We're going to go over some of the financial considerations for projects. And I'm sorry, I'm actually at work today. I'm on a call. I came into the office today. We're onboarding a new employee today, and they just tried to come in. So sorry. So we're going to go over the financial considerations today, and then I want to leave sufficient time at the end for people a form to like ask questions of us and different things like that. I think we've been answering all the questions that we've been getting in through email, but I know that oftentimes it kind of helps to verbalize questions as well too. Present another opportunity because maybe if somebody else is asking a question on the line and you hear that question, it kind of sparks something that you haven't considered for your project either. So we're going to make sure we leave some time to do that today too. All right. And okay, so today what we'll cover is the pre-award costs, management costs, allowable costs, some of the administrative requirements and cost principles that we're required to adhere to from the Code of Federal Regulations. The reimbursement, remind you of the cost share breakdowns. We have a few other reminders, then we'll open up for questions, and then we'll wrap everything up. So for pre-award costs, so your pre-award costs, I like to say that's the seed money, or not really the seed money, but like any type of funding that you or cost you incur for the actual development of your application. So if you were using contractor support to develop your benefit cost analysis or anything else to develop your actual application, those are going to be your pre-award costs. So they need to be incurred within a reasonable time frame prior to the date of your application, though. So I would say, if it's something like, oh, you started this process, 7 years ago, that's probably not going to be a reasonable time frame. But certainly anything you've done over the course of the past few months or even a year, you can look at including that. If you have very specific questions and you think something might be way out of the scope, please let us know. We'll be happy to kind of walk through that with you. And I think the most important thing to remember whenever it comes to costs for these projects, or honestly anything, very important to document as much as possible. I kind of go by the rule of thumb that literally every input into these applications and the budget and stuff like that, you should be able to have some type of support documentation to justify what you're entering into the application. And that even includes, we've even had it where we will put in an input data from the census. Well, they still want a printout of that census page showing that that is where the data came from. So that type of stuff is very important. So for your pre-award costs, you will include those within your sub-application budget. This is kind of like your one shot to include costs. So if it's not included up front, there are some pathways we can take to re-budget the project, but it's really important to note that with these type of awards, so we call them non-disaster, they're done by congressional appropriations each year. And BRIC is a little bit different, but still this applies. So you cannot come back and say, oh, well, this was under budget, so now we're requesting an additional $10,000. If you incur additional costs above what was approved for your project, then unfortunately you are responsible for absorbing that cost. And there really aren't that many means to try and get additional federal dollars to support those cost overages. So your pre-award costs, they can be reimbursed with the federal grant dollars. And so I just want to take a second to really walk through this part though. So for pre-award costs, you can either count them towards your 25% share. So if you say that, hey, we spent X amount of dollars to obtain contractors to develop the BCA. So you can go ahead and count that towards your non-federal share, or you can either get reimbursed for it through the federal dollars, and then that would be contributed, taken away from the 75% share. And then the last thing is that any costs that are associated with actually implementing the project, those are not eligible. So I like to just say no activity, no shovel in the ground, none of that can start before you get that FEMA approval letter. And if those activities do take place before you get the approval letter, then you can't get the federal reimbursement for them. So next up, costs. So this supports basically your direct costs and your indirect costs to actually implement and carry out the grant award. So this also needs to be identified within your scope of work, and it needs to be a line item in your budget. And for management costs, what you'll do is you can request up to a maximum of 5% of your total project costs. So when you are in FEMA Go and going through your budget, essentially you want to put in all your project costs first, and then take 5% of that grand total, and then you'll add that to your project costs. And then for your pre-award costs, you don't need to submit proof of payment with your sub-application, but when you request that reimbursement, you will need to submit the proof of payment. Sorry. All right. So in FEMA, they'll provide, this is at 100% federal share, so you don't have to cost share any of this. So normally they'll request management costs for supporting the development of the application. So this can include staff time devoted towards the project development, geocoding mitigation projects. So generally we don't see a lot of that in Maryland, because we're not doing a lot of projects at the level of some other states. Like some of my colleagues in the Midwest, they might do 200 acquisition demolition projects within one grant cycle. And so that would require a lot of back end work to make sure all that information is accurately coded and just collected, and that those records are there. So providing technical assistance, if you're providing technical assistance to homeowners so that they can compile information if you're doing like an individual homeowner project, the project management, and then the staff salary cost as well too. So those are different examples of what you could utilize management costs for. All right. So then what type of costs, like overall in the project, are going to be considered allowable? So all of this text is pulled directly from the Code of Federal Regulations. So when it comes to anything dealing with like the financials of the project, a lot of times it is going to be information pulled directly from the Code of Federal Regulations. That's kind of like the law of the land. And we can provide the citations for this stuff too, but essentially it's going to be 2 CFR 200 is what we're always referencing. So the costs, they need to be necessary and reasonable. So we'll go over what reasonable costs would be in the subsequent slide. You need to make sure that you're conforming to any limitations that are set forth by the award. And so FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance guidance, they provide a variety of examples of like ineligible costs, different things like that. One thing I will note is that a lot of the guidance is very much geared towards a construction type project. And so with BRIC, in the introduction of this new category, the capacity and capability building category, where it's not necessarily for a construction type activity, there is not a lot of guidance currently right now for like what type of cost would be allowed, what type of cost would not be allowed, and would be ineligible. My recommendation for that is, again, to just think very reasonably about what you're asking for in the project. Are the costs that you're requesting, do they actually support the implementation of the proposal that you're putting forth? And if there are any things that FEMA feels like it is egregious and is ineligible, they will contact you, should you continue moving forward in the review process, contact you to rebudget the project and to remove those costs as well too. All right. So it all needs to be consistent with the policies and procedures for the federal institution and then the non-federal entity as well too. So we like to describe it as like the Russian dolls that you stack. So you have to meet your federal requirements, your state requirements, and your local requirements as well too. And the most restrictive of all of those requirements is what you will follow. All right. And then you need to be consistent in how you are looking at the cost as well too. All right. And then for this in particular, like if you are, we'll say using staff time. So if I am person A working on, you know, the FEMA hazard mitigation assistance grants, and my salary is being used to meet the 25% share of the mitigation grants, well, I also cannot like use my salary to meet another grant cost share requirement either, unless, you know, like there was space, quote unquote. So we're using X amount of dollars here and X amount of dollars in another area too. All right. And then the last thing is to make sure you document. The documentation is so important. All right. So what is reasonable? So basically, I kind of like to use the rule of thumb. If you open up the Baltimore Sun, I'm going to use Baltimore because I live in Baltimore. So if you open up the Baltimore Sun, you know, one morning over breakfast, and you see that the government spent X amount on whatever the expenditure was, like, would you be upset about that? And so that's why I like to say, like, just think, I would say use your own kind of personal guidance to determine if something seems reasonable or not. But there are other things as well too. So looking at, is this like on target with the market prices for that area? So I'll use an example. A home elevation for Smith Island is much more expensive than anywhere else in the state of Maryland. And the reason is that due to the location of Smith Island, all of the equipment actually has to be ferried over. So that causes a much greater increase. But granted, like the cost of an elevation in Smith Island should not be the same as a cost elevation in another area, because that extra transportation cost isn't applicable in that geographic area. All right, so these are just like a list of other things that you want to keep in mind. So basically, just be very thoughtful and like the type of cost that you're asking for, which is another reason that you want to make sure that you are documenting everything. So if somebody does say like, hey, this cost seems like a lot, then you can say, okay, well, here is the quote, you know, from the contractor, from the vendor, or whatever the case may be, so that you have that extra piece of documentation. All right, so a list of some eligible costs. And again, a lot of the guidance is honestly, it's very geared towards construction type activities. And so again, just be thoughtful and make sure that when you're developing like your capacity and capability building applications, that the costs still align with what's required to implement the proposal. So you can include contingency costs. So essentially the contingency is going to be used to cover like unforeseen circumstances throughout the project, but the contingency will not be available immediately because you probably won't experience any unforeseen circumstance immediately. So you can request up to a maximum of 5% of the project cost. And for historic properties, when historic properties are involved, you can request a maximum of 6%. So important things to note, it does not cover inflation. And so a lot of times people like to say, well, it's taken us 2 years to like get the funding for this. So, you know, the cost of labor, the cost of materials will go up. And I certainly understand that. Unfortunately, these are the federal requirements that we have to follow. So even though, yes, the process does take quite a long time, you cannot specifically request for inflation to be considered in your project budget either though. And again, the important thing is just to document. So if you start to, like when you're experiencing cost overruns and stuff like that, making sure that you're documenting those so that when you request to find contingency, you have the documentation for all of that. So other eligible costs would be the design and engineering, labor, materials, inspections and permits. I would say just like a lot of lessons learned about inspections from, again, more construction-based projects is like, don't skip out on the inspection. Definitely include that in your budget and ensure that you all are conducting inspections, especially if it's like for a home elevation or something like that, to make sure that it is feasible to actually carry out the project. So the actual construction and then the project administration as well too. All right, so again, for construction projects, I feel like you guys kind of maybe have like the upper hand a little bit because FEMA has already developed a lot of construction focused materials for you. So one example is FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance Addendum. They have this really nice chart already laid out that essentially covers a lot of the most common costs that are eligible for like an acquisition demolition type project. So you'll see here, it goes into a lot of detail, right down to removal of trees, could be included, grading, capping wells, and etc. So if you have a construction activity, most likely there are a lot of resources out here like that you can also reference to see if you're covering everything in your budget essentially. Okay, so I just want to reiterate, these programs for MEMA are administered as a reimbursement program. I like to make sure everybody understands that before we go too far into the project. So what will happen is that once you're awarded, after you incur a cost, you pay for that cost. You will then supply us with the documentation of that paid expense, and then you will be reimbursed by MEMA. The other thing to note, again, speaking to these projects being like in this non-disaster category. So for most projects, the standard cost share is going to be 75% federal and then 25% non-federal. If you have a budget underrun in your project, then your 75% federal share, that decreases, right? So we're looking at total project cost. So if you started off and the project was going to be $50,000, but then it drops down to $40,000, you will only be reimbursed for 75% of that $40,000. Now, on the reverse side of that, if you are over budget on your project, you'll only be awarded the maximum 75% that was originally awarded. So it doesn't work both ways, unfortunately. Like when the budget decreases, the federal share decreases, but when the budget increases, the federal share does not increase. It stays at that set dollar amount. All right. So just to talk about or reiterate, I guess, a little bit, the funding availability and the categories. So for the recommendations that we initially sent out after the NOIs, if you applied for something that was in that capacity and capability building category, I kind of put a note in there too, just to put things really into perspective. So overall, because we review all our NOIs, the FMA and the BRIC NOIs together, but overall in this particular category of funding, we receive roughly $15 million in NOI. So $15 million of interest in this particular category. Under FMA and in BRIC, each one of those grant programs, there is the possibility for a state to request up to $600,000 in each one of those grants for the capacity and capability building category. Also within those $600 pots, we can request up to $300,000 for plans. So like for the state of Maryland right now, we have approximately 12 local hazard mitigation plans that are on par to be updated and therefore request grant funding for this year. So we're going to prioritize $300,000 out of our available $600,000 for those plans for the BRIC program. Now, for the FMA program, we have a little bit more flexibility because we don't have a lot of communities that are requesting flood mitigation plans, but we still had a great deal of interest when we received the NOIs for that $600,000. So I just want to make that very clear. So what I am saying is that the capacity building categories of funding are going to be extremely competitive. Number one, within the state. So when you submit the application and we start having to review and rank those to determine how we'll submit stuff to FEMA, it's going to be very competitive. So again, reasons why we just want you to make sure that you're documenting everything and really telling the story in your applications. Okay, and then for BRIC, after we surpass the capacity and capability building and the 600,000 and the planning and everything, then for like the total pot of money available nationwide is going to be $446.4 million for like regular construction projects, I'll say. So per sub applicant, so like an individual state agency or an individual local government, you can receive a maximum of $50 million. So that means if your DPW is requesting funding and your planning department is requesting funding together as a local jurisdiction, you can only receive $50 million. And normally we do like a really good job, and I'll say at the local level too, people do a really good job of communicating and just making sure like everybody is aware of what's being submitted within your jurisdiction. But again, as we're reviewing applications, we'll also like keep our eye out for that as well too. And then the other category is the direct technical assistance, which we didn't have anybody in Maryland express interest in that category for this year. but definitely something moving forward. We'll also look at opportunities for how to pursue that type of assistance. All right. So the cost share for BRIC standard is the 75% breakdown. There is a possibility for an increased cost share of 90% federal and 10% non-federal if you are considered a small impoverished community by FEMA's standards. So you need to have 3,000 or fewer individuals. And this can't be like a neighborhood within a community. It has to actually be kind of like a standalone community, if you will. And then the average per capita annual income cannot exceed 80% of the national ranking or kind of spectrum. So with all of that, you still have to submit documentation of this increased federal cost share when you submit your application. If FEMA feels like your documentation does not justify you meeting the criteria, then they will bump you back up to that 75-25% split. So this is like the particular instance where I was saying, even when you pull it and it says the census is saying you have 82 people in your community, FEMA still wants you to actually provide the documentation for that. So in terms of FMA, there are several categories within FMA. So they have the project scoping category, which is essentially very similar to the capacity and capability building category, only you can't do those activities like the partnership building, building codes, etc. It is strictly for the project scoping. So again, maximum $600,000 per state. The community flood mitigation, so those are for larger scale projects, maximum $300 or $30 million per sub applicant. For the technical assistance category, the state of Maryland does not meet those requirements due to us receiving previous funding for the hazard mitigation grant program subsequent to receiving presidential disaster declarations. Then you have the flood mitigation planning category, and then the individual mitigation projects category. So earlier, just note that for BRIC, planning is within capacity and capability building, but then for FMA, there is a separate planning category. Right. And then for the FMA cost share, it's a little bit different. So again, the standard 75-25% split, and then they provide increased cost share if you are considered a repetitive loss or a severe repetitive loss property. The one thing I'll note about this is that for the HMA programs, your repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss status it has different criteria than the standard NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, definitions of repetitive and non-repetitive loss. So we've provided here the definitions that HMA uses, and FEMA actually has a list. So for all the people who submitted NOIs that were for individual property, I've already responded back to you to let you know if you met the criteria or not. If anybody still has a question, please email us and we'll be happy to kind of check that and confirm for you as well too. All right, so some reminders. Document, literally cannot say that enough, honestly. Make sure that you're not putting in any lump sum costs. Everything needs to be broken down into multiple line items, including the quantities and then the unit cost as well too. And I think one of the really important things that I don't believe we mentioned yet is to make sure if you're using contractor support for developing your sub applications, that you're still in compliance with the procurement requirements. So even though you have not technically received federal funding yet, you still have to go through like a competitive bidding process and so forth on that. So we do have a job aid that we can provide to people if you have some very specific questions about using contractor support prior to receiving the grant award. But essentially, I tell people that you can't have somebody write the test and then take the test as well too. So you can certainly go to a contractor to get like cost estimates to support your budget and stuff like that. But if they are writing the actual specifications for your sub application, for your proposal, they cannot then subsequently come back and bid in a competitive bidding process on that project. All right. So then the last few reminders, please, if you have not registered in FEMA Go, email us at the mitigation.mema@maryland.gov email account. We've gotten quite a few people registered, so we're excited about that. I went through a few days ago, I don't know if it was last week or not, but I went through, and basically if you were listed as a point of contact on an NOI, but I don't have you as registered in FEMA Go, I've sent a reminder email just again so we can make sure everybody is registered. We also have the capability now with FEMA Go to look and see what actual sub applications are starting to be entered into the system. So just to make sure everybody is like kind of on the ball with everything, I'll go through those as well too. And if there are NOIs where people definitely showed interest, but we don't see an application yet, might send you a reminder email as well too. And I certainly understand that people are, going to use the like Word document application and fill that out first and then just plug and play into FEMA Go. But we just want to make sure we have the word out, because there's a lot of information coming out this year, and there is a lot of new grant program, new grant management system, and a lot of people who might be newer to the process as well too. So apologize in advance for the emails. I am trying to start being like more concise in our communications and stuff like that. But please, if you see an email from our team, just open it. Don't delete it. I know it can seem overwhelming, but we're trying our best to make sure we get all the information out. So again, the sub applications will be due November 20th. Subsequent to that, MEMA will submit stuff to the state clearinghouse. We'll check for a completeness review. We'll convene the state's mitigation advisory committee to also review and rank the projects. And then the state application is due to FEMA January 29th. The state of Maryland will not be waiting until January 29th to submit. FEMA actually stops offering technical assistance about 2 to 3 days prior to this deadline. And we encounter a technical difficulty every single time. So we'll be submitting much earlier than that deadline, just to make sure that we can submit everybody's applications, and there's nothing that we're doing that's prohibiting any of our communities from being able to pursue funding. So after that, it'll be roughly like a 6-month period. And then we receive kind of like a preliminary notification that basically says, hey, you didn't meet the eligibility requirements. We're not moving you forward because we don't have enough funding, or they say you've been selected for further review. And then that's when they'll take another like 3 to 6 months to complete their environmental and historic preservation review. And then hopefully after that, you'll be awarded, which is projected to be somewhere in the December 2020 timeframe. All right, so I'm going to stop now and start answering questions. And I see there's only one in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read that one, but other folks feel free to also put stuff in the chat
there's
too.
a few in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, Jaleesa, there's a couple in the chat.
Okay. I see one from Paul. I think that's
There's one above. I think Kristen gave an answer, but I don't know if everyone can see the chat, so it might be worth just reviewing it.
Yeah. Okay.
From Carol Buckmaster.
So there was a question, for pre-award costs, do we need to submit proof of payment with the sub-application? So if you are requesting pre-award costs within the sub-application, you can provide documentation to justify the cost for FEMA's awareness. However, when you request reimbursement, if the project has been awarded, you will have to include proof of payment to MEMA as well too. And then from Paul, does severe repetitive loss documentation need to be identified for the project site specifically, or is it possible to identify it at the county scale and still have it count for the project? So based on how the NOFO was worded, FEMA wants your RL and SRL data to be site specific. All right. And Jean, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Does the budget have to match the cost and benefit cost analysis?
Okay, so that's a really good question. and we get this one a lot. So essentially, when you go in for your benefit cost analysis, it'll ask you for the project cost. So that's where you'll take like that total project cost from your application and put in the BCA. And then you'll also notice that the BCA asks you for your annual maintenance cost, and then they annualize that for the project life, project useful life. And then they'll add in those maintenance costs, and they establish, I like to call it a new total project cost for your BCA purposes. But you don't need to include your maintenance costs within your sub-application costs. And Kristen, also, if you have anything to add, feel free.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. And does anybody else have questions? Feel free to put them into the chat, or to use the raise hand feature, or if you can safely take yourself off mute, feel free to do that as well too. Okay. Yes, Jean.
Yes. Another question. You mentioned that some of the costs related to the management and having the engineering and consultant assistance to develop the application. Those costs may be listed, but it's not necessary to list, because the concern is it will change the benefit cost analysis. We want to be to have the number as favorable as possible.
So technically, your project should include all costs contributing to the project. However, if there are costs that are not being requested for federal reimbursement or for non-federal share, I think you are okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll give it a few more seconds for anybody else that might have a question. All right, hearing none, we will wrap up for the day. So again, thank you everybody so much. I know it's kind of been a marathon for us to get to this final technical assistance session. I know for me personally, at least, it has definitely felt like it. But again, I really hope that these were very beneficial for you all. We felt it was in the best interest to try and provide these dedicated sessions, because the program is new, Fema Go is new, and we want to make sure that everybody has all of the most recent and up-to-date information that we have as well too. So with that being said, thank you again. I do strongly encourage everybody, if you have questions, to submit them to mitigation.mema@maryland.gov. While I appreciate everybody emailing me directly, it does not help us make sure we're providing everybody a very high level of customer service, because I'm a little overwhelmed. So if you email the mitigation.mema email account, it'll give us an opportunity to make sure that our entire team can view your questions and respond to those, so we can respond back to you as quickly as possible. And so with that, good luck. We're excited, and we're here for you over the next couple of weeks as you finish and finalize your application. And with that, have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.